I had planned on moving on to something else, but all the news update felt me somewhat compelled to revisit this whole thing because some of it seems to back up what I was saying before, or at least gives a little bit more evidence to that effect. The source of the leak that I mentioned in the previous video has been revealed to be a U.S. airman in the Air National Guard. And the documents found in the Discord chat area are the same documents the media has been discussing. Friends describe him as a show-off, and he does not have pro-Russian tendencies. So far, I have not seen anyone show any kind of indication that the supposedly doctored documents that the media was originally saying was the case are any different than the ones that were found in the Discord. And particularly, so that would mean these are pretty much original. So if they can't show that there are two different sets of documents, that means the two things that they are denying as disinformation: one, that the Russian casualties are a fifth of what are being officially reported to the press, and that there are special operations forces operating in Ukraine. Both of those would appear to be true as opposed to disinformation. The narrative that the casualty figures have been altered to lower numbers would appear to be either U.S. government or media disinformation. Russian casualties in the official briefing appear to be one-fifth what the Pentagon briefers have been telling the media. So this tells us that the Ukrainians are not doing as well as the media would tell you, and there's a reasonable chance that the entire narrative of the war as we understand it may be incorrect. And what I'm inferring, I'll get into that. This also means the narrative of Russian incompetence and Ukrainian stunning victories is at least, at best, flawed. It probably means Ukraine isn't doing that well. It suggests heavily that the narrative of the total Russian conquest of Ukraine may be exactly what I suggested, that it's a fig leaf to grant Ukraine a victory should the resolution of the war result with Russia still holding Ukrainian territory. My assertion was that the Russians absolutely did plan on taking the entirety of the Donbass, that they did absolutely want to decapitate the Ukrainian government. I also said that I considered it likely that Russia would want to keep a land bridge to Crimea, but that's not that's not as absolute as the other two assertions. And I said at the very outside, Moscow might want to divide Ukraine in the vicinity of the Dnieper River. I think this is unlikely, but since the Russians have had to pay a higher price, they actually may be considering the idea that they want a little bit more out of this. Now, I found a really interesting interactive map that I'm going to try to use here. It's going to be a little clumsy, maybe me getting into it. Bear with me. But it helps. It's really good visual aid explaining what happened, and it kind of helps, I think, back up what I've been saying about this war. So let me bring this up. Okay, and I will have a link to this map because, like I said, I consider it to be a really decent visual aid for what's going on. Okay, so now we're going to look at what happened between 24 February and 30 March. And the particular events there aren't all that important, but see some of the things we're seeing there. See how like the little fingers are starting to stretch out. That would be indicative of the Russian army running along the roads because there's probably a lot of areas where it's too muddy for them to cross. And up in the north, right above Kiev, we have this incursion coming in. Uh, the best estimate we have is that the Russian task force heading to Kiev had about 15,000 troops. You can see the issues with the troops becoming road bound, likely the issues of the mud that I had talked about before. And it seems like they're attempting to deliver a knockout blow to Kiev. Uh, if their goal was to hold that area, you would suspect that they probably would have put more troops up there and less against other areas, because taking out Kiev theoretically would have shut down most of the resistance. Okay, advance this to the 30th. Okay, now we see them basically coming in contact with Kiev and starting to surround it. And they had incursions into the city at this time. They also attempted, in advance of this, to seize the airport. Okay. So casualties from that battle are, in fact, fairly minimal. We had essentially two different waves of paratroops attempt to take the Kiev airport. The Ukrainians apparently had very good intelligence. They set up an extraordinarily excellent defense of the airport. The Russians weren't able to take it. My guess is that their plan was to seize it and then essentially perform vertical envelopment and try to seize Kiev that way. By shutting that down, it probably made the Kiev takeover a lot harder than it would have been otherwise. The battle for Kiev was also low on casualties. 167 dead on the Ukrainian side. And again, supposedly this was an all-out war. Western media would only describe Russian losses as heavy, but no numbers. The Russians claim minimal casualties. Then, as quickly as the Russians moved in, they pulled out. They likely lacked the supplies to push past Kiev or even hold it for any length of time. Clearly, the Russians overestimated their ability here, and the Ukrainians did a great job preparing for this. And this is probably a good example of the U.S. intelligence giving them huge abilities to prep in advance of the Russian movements. So now we're going to go through to the 6th of April, and we see a rapid withdrawal in the north. It indicates that once the objective of taking the government was gone, there was no further military need to be there. Holding Kiev or territory north or northeast of there wasn't part of the plan. I mean, if they really wanted Kiev, they would have set up for a long-term siege. Their goal was decapitation. So let's watch this quick withdrawal. Gone. Uh, so, yeah, clearly, and a lot of the more neutral observers state that this was a Russian withdrawal. They weren't pushed out by the Ukrainians. And they said it was actually executed in very good order. So then basically we see, I'm going to run it through to 6 September. We're seeing consolidation of the gains in the Donbass area and in the land bridge to Crimea. If the goal was to occupy all of Ukraine, it shows gross lack of capabilities on both sides. Neither side is able to gain any major ground. Likely, most sides lack the capacity to move their force very far from the existing occupied areas. So one of the things that to pay attention to is look at the area of the Russian border on Ukraine that's outside the Donbass area. Wouldn't you think that if this was an all out war, you'd see troops attacking across that border? Why are they staying entirely contained to this smaller area down here? Well, it kind of backs up my assertion, and we see these blue areas popping up. These are, in fact, the Ukrainian areas being taken back. Now, I think some of these areas are actually the Russians just pulling back because they're having more difficult time in some of the areas than they expected. Uh, we don't see a whole lot of video that backs up the idea that these particular battles are uh, Ukraine pushing the Russians out as much as the Russians pulling back for reasons that we don't aren't fully given, probably to consolidate. They probably did underestimate the Ukrainians going in, so they probably had to start removing troops to other areas to basically bolster up efforts they're working on. Now, one of the areas in the northeast, Kharkiv, uh, that was a city the Russians never fully took over and they ended up pulling back from. And we see that there were several cities in the land bridge area that uh, essentially took several weeks, if not months, for the Russians to actually take over. Okay, so for this next part, it appears that the Russians were overextended in Kherson. That's the area over the Dnieper River above the Crimea area. Ukraine reacted very well here, and everything appears to be that they were getting both exceptional intelligence and probably help on the ground with spotting, aiming, and hitting targets. Uh, what ended up happening is the Ukrainians suddenly lashed out and started hitting high value targets with incredible accuracy, hitting supply areas on the other side of the Dnieper. They also started hitting the bridges crossing the Dnieper, making it really hard for the Russians to hold that area. The Russian found do that to the destruction of forward supplies and the cutting of the bridges on the Dnieper. They lacked the ability to hold the area and contest the Ukrainians. Both sides' numbers are off from each other, but it's likely that both sides lost thousands, with Russia taking about 1.5 to 2 times the casualties of Ukraine. So let's watch the reduction of that pocket there through 6 November. And this is an action that I do believe the Ukrainians actually did contest the Russians. I mean, it was a well executed battle plan. I mean, they knew all the Russian weak points, pointing to heavy use of U.S. intelligence. They struck with incredible accuracy, pointing to the likelihood that there were probably U.S. and British special forces helping them direct fire. They would essentially have direct access to satellite comms and be able to because they have extraordinary amounts of experience at this, the ability to um, basically find and hit targets uh, very easily. And again, uh, from about this point forward, we'll see again that the Russians will pull back over the Dnieper at this point because they can't hold it due to supply reasons. But once again, I'm going to do a relatively quick advance because the rest of it's pretty much a stalemate. But again, look at that stretch of border between Russia and Ukraine above the Donbass region, and there's literally no activity there whatsoever. To me, that indicates that, okay, so there's where the Kherson pocket finally gets pushed back over the Dnieper. If this was an all-out war, why wouldn't the Russians be pushing across there again? If the Russians wanted all of Ukraine, why wouldn't they be attacking there? Why wouldn't they be attacking again through Belarus? Well, either they completely lack the supplies to do so, which is somewhat questionable, or they never planned on taking these in the first place. And this is the area where time period where essentially everything pretty much turned to mud. I mean, it had been mud most of the time period. Essentially, they had an overly warm winter, so the mud seasons went much longer than they had previously. And if you use this interactive map yourself, you can click on the events that are popping up, especially towards the end here, getting up to current times. There isn't really a lot going on with those other than, a few random hits outside the major region of conflict. We did hear within the last couple days Russians claiming that they may have actually completely taken Bakhmut. Don't know at this point. Ukrainians say they still have a toehold in portions of the city. I think either is likely. But I believe the whole fighting around Bakhmut was an attrition action. And again, the Russians can afford the only way the Ukrainians win the attrition war is by killing 8 Russians for every Ukrainian. And even in the best numbers being given to us, those numbers were somewhere around equal sides of 100,000 each. In the worst numbers that were reported in the released documents, essentially the Russians had about 17,000 to the Ukrainians 100,000. And if that's the case, the Russians are pretty much doing what they want when they want. So another revelation from the leaked documents is the existence of special forces from the United States and UK and Ukraine. Any student of the wars like this would know that this was already a given. In fact, I mentioned it in several videos that I suspected that the reason why the Ukrainians were getting some of these precision hits was because they were getting expert help on the ground. The day before the leaker was discovered, but the leaks were already found, the Brits dismissed the idea of 50 special ops of their guys in Ukraine as disinformation. It was probably 49 or 51, because, if you don't say it exactly, then it's disinformation. Yesterday, the U.S. claimed that what special forces were in Ukraine were only there for embassy support. So ultimately, This is a very dangerous situation, and it's brought to you by the same people who destabilized the Middle East to the point where ISIS, an Islamic caliphate, rose and was ruling the area the size of Texas. And then the same people told us they were powerless to stop us, or stop it, until the next president rolled in and basically took out the caliphate. The same people who thought it was the same these are the same people who thought it was a good idea to topple stable regimes in Syria and Libya and replace them with warring factions. These are the same people who backed a war between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, costing 350,000 lives to no apparent gain. These are the same people who think it's smarter to buy oil from Iran and Venezuela rather than produce it ourselves. These are also the same people who presided over the Afghanistan pullout. These are the same people who did the diplomatic setup for the Ukrainian invasion. Not insinuating that they wanted it to happen, but obviously their diplomacy failed. These are the same people who have created a growing alliance of Russia, China, and Iran against the West. So we are supposed to trust that this time they know what they're doing, and they're not going to push this to the point where it turns into a world war or a nuclear war. I'm skeptical, to say the least. Now, what are you thinking about the released documents below? Comment. Do you think there is a Russian disinformation version of the documents that are different from what this A1C released? The media seems to be really highlighting the stuff where we've been spying on allies and kind of ignoring the stuff that they were calling disinformation previously. Is anybody talking about that out there that you're aware of? Again, comment below. Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithm brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, please consider subscribing. And if you know somebody who might find this interesting, share it with them. Well, thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.